Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to speak less as Secretary General of the United Nations and more as a citizen of the world, a multilateralist and a globalist. When I was in office in my country, I was a European federalist, and I became a frustrated European federalist. I hope I will not become a frustrated multilateralist and globalist. But indeed, I do believe that globalization, free trade, but also technological progress are not only irreversible, but they are essentially good. Now, that does not mean that everybody agrees with that. And the reason is because the same globalization, the same free trade, the same technological progress have left some people behind. They were not good to everybody. Even if the overwhelming majority of the population benefited economically, socially, the truth is that in the rust belts of this world were regions left behind, or sectors left behind, or people left behind, especially in the countries in which poverty was and is more dramatic. And this has generated a lack of trust in political systems, lack of trust in international organizations like the UN, lack of trust in other institutions, financial sectors. And because of that, we felt that it would be necessary to try to mobilize the international community with a clear, common, universal goal of a fair globalization. And that is what is looking into sustainable and inclusive development is behind the two main decisions of 2015, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and the approval by the General Assembly of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, contrary to the Millennium Development Goals that were before and that were simple, 8 simple objectives, very clear to explain, very easy to mobilize the international community around them, but at the same time very limited in its scope. The Sustainable Development Goals is indeed a comprehensive and universal global strategy for sustainable and inclusive development. And so it's complex and it's difficult to explain. And at the present moment, I would say the diplomatic community is on board, many governments are on board, but still the essential factor to make it work has very little knowledge about it, and that is the private sector. Because when we look at the investments that will be necessary for this Agenda 2030, for these Sustainable Development Goals in all areas, from eradication of poverty to education, to health, to oceans, to energy, for all these things to be possible, the level of official development aid that was crucial in the Millennium Development Goals is absolutely insufficient. And so our 3 main concerns are the following. First, to support governments to create their own resource base. We are trying to help governments to do their tax reforms, to be able to create conditions, especially in the most vulnerable areas of the world, for governments to be able to raise resources within their own countries and not to be totally dependent on the outside. Second, to mobilize the official development aid, that of course is necessary and that still has a crucial role to play. But third and more important is to mobilize both innovative financing and the private sector to be fully engaged in these goals. And for that, obviously, a number of things are necessary. We will be trying to support governments in creating the right legal environments, the right governance mechanisms to fight corruption, to create conditions of certainty for investments to be able to be attractive. And this is a very important role, and in many areas of the world there is a big way to go. And in some, there are levels of fragility or conflict that make it very, very difficult. But on the other hand, we believe it's necessary to ask the international financial institutions to leverage resources through different forms of innovative finance, and also those that are active in the capital markets to do the same. Just to give an example, the green bonds are becoming a more and more successful instrument, and we believe that we need to have a multiplication of these instruments in different sorts to allow for investments to be funded, for projects to be bankable in the context of this global strategy. And obviously, private investment is absolutely crucial in order to be able to create the jobs, to develop the sectors, to create the conditions for societies to allow for their citizens to benefit of economic growth, to benefit of improved levels of technology, to benefit in relation to the access to the global markets. Now, here is the difficulty, is to be able to raise awareness of the private sector everywhere and to ask entrepreneurs to look into the business opportunities that exist Most of the companies around these tables are global. You operate in different countries. We are asking the governments of those countries to include the Sustainable Development Goals in their budgets, in their strategies, but at the same time to create the environment and to reach out to the private sector, local and international, to be able to actively, both in climate change and in development, to be able to do simultaneously what is profitable, what makes sense from their business point of view, and what can help make globalization something that, in which the benefits can spread to everybody. To make things even more complicated, everything is changing very quickly. And we are facing the beginning of the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And it is clear that there will be, in the next years, until 2030, a dramatic impact in global labor markets. Lots of things will move. Things that are today profitable with one configuration will completely change in the way production, distribution, services exist in the world. We are going to have huge impacts in the structure of societies. Look at the impacts of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and many others. And so, at the same time that we are doing our best to address the problems of today, we need also to engage in governments and international organizations and the private sector and the academia and the research centers to have a meaningful dialogue on what will be the impact of these inevitable technological changes in the world of tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And how can we prepare people? How can we invest in people, in skills, to allow for the kind of transformations that are inevitable not to be devastating for many of the societies around the world, or for many of the regions, even in the most rich societies in the world. The rust belts can multiply in a much more dramatic way when we'll see all the impacts of all the changes that are now being developed in IT, in bio sectors, and in many other aspects. And so, again, it's very important to have the private sector engaging in this discussion. Regulatory frameworks of the past will no longer be valid. Governments alone will not be able to find the right ways. We need to have strategies in which everybody is involved at global and national level. And my appeal to all of you in your areas of business is to engage, to try to understand what is being done, and again, doing the right thing from the point of view of your companies, trying to help create the momentum along the ideas that are on the table, both to make globalization more inclusive, second, to make climate action more effective, and finally, to have an honest discussion among all parties to this issue on how to face the challenges of tomorrow and prepare the people for those challenges to become an element of positive development and not a negative destructuring factor in our societies. We count very much on you, on your engagement. This is not an easy job because, it's, as I said, it's a complex set of objectives. It will require the convergence of governments, international organizations, capital markets, private sector, international financial institutions. But we believe it's the right thing to do because the levels of mistrust that have been accumulating in the world, the levels of conflict that we see emerging a little bit everywhere are making our world relatively dangerous. And I think it's better to prevent than to go on managing these conflicts without being able to guarantee that and I believe that it's true for business, that the best condition for business to prosper, that is peace, can prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. You've just come off an extraordinarily busy week of your first General Assembly, and there seemed as though this year there were even more meetings taking place with private sector leaders in and around town. All of the New Yorkers are just now recovering from post-traumatic traffic disorder. And so I wonder, because a lot of what we've talked about today has been about focus, and I hate to ask you to choose amongst your children, but if you had to pick of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which ones you think private business can have the greatest impact on, where you would like to see a room like this really focus their efforts?
The central one is the first one, the eradication of poverty. And the best way to eradicate poverty is jobs. So the question is how to create jobs in today's world, how to create the environment in which the creation of jobs is possible. And that means government action in creating the proper and the adequate framework, and that means private investment in making sure that productive sectors are developed. And they are developed in a way that is inclusive and that doesn't leave certain areas of the world behind, or that doesn't leave, in a country like the United States, certain regions or certain sectors behind.
You talked about trust a number of times, and I wonder if the precondition is how does business at a moment of rising populism even create the context where people believe that business can be a force for good in addressing these issues?
Well, it's easy to condemn populism, but I think it's better to analyze why it emerged and why it's developing. No? And if one looks at today's societies, we see that people are feeling insecure. First of all, physically insecure. I mean, you look at, just look at the map. You start in Nigeria and then you go to Mali, from Mali to Libya, from Libya to Somalia, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. All these conflicts are becoming interlinked, but much more serious than these. They are becoming linked with a threat of global terrorism. And this terrorism strikes globally, and it's linked by the internet. So in any community, in any city in the United States or in Europe, a group of people can be at the present moment planning something because they are mobilized by the level of anger that exists in some other part of the world related to religious feelings or political feelings or whatever. So there is a sense of physical insecurity. But on top of that, technological evolution and globalization, especially more technological evolution than globalization, have had an impact in the security of jobs. No? I mean, in my parents' time, people would have a job all its life. In my time, most people, I had several professions, but most people have the same profession along the life. In my son's time, people will change profession several times. I also did so, but it was a kind of a precursor. No? And so, I mean, this creates some insecurity. No? And in this environment, there are winners and losers. And in the losers, there is a sense that governments are not taking care of them. Because that governments are not taking care of them, I mean, there is a mistrust about political systems. Then they feel international organizations are not doing the right job, that we're just spending money and not really. And so this level of mistrust is having a very negative impact in the way societies are reacting. And we see referenda being lost, not because the question is relevant, but because people will say no, independently of what the question is. You see different trends in the political spectrum of different countries. And so the only way to respond to this is, obviously, we cannot generate the security of the past, is to be able to mobilize people to better respond to the insecurities of the future and to feel equipped for that. And that means investing in a number of very important things. And of course, the advantage of the Sustainable Development Goals is that they provide a framework to help governments and to help institutions and the private sector to do so, not only in the developing world, but everywhere. Because I think that the impact of this fourth industrial revolution in societies will be dramatic, north and south. It's not only in the south, it's also in the north. We will see countries that have bet in low manpower industrial development being dramatically impacted when those factories will just disappear from there and be completely impacted by robots and artificial. But we also see in the developed world areas that will completely disappear. I mean, that's just, how many drivers are there in the United States? Maybe in 20 years' time, there will be no drivers. I mean, are we prepared for these things? Are we preparing our societies for these things? Are we discussing how we can invest in people to be prepared for this? So I think it's very important to just not doing business as usual and go on like that, but to really be concerned, to question ourselves, are we doing the right thing, and to try to engage. Because these problems will not be solved like in the past. No, in the past, theoretically, people would expect governments to solve problems, and you expect the markets to work and to provide. Now, I think we need a serious discussion involving, as I mentioned, governments, international institutions, the private sector, those that are relevant in financial markets, but also the research centers. I mean, on how can we together, I wouldn't say regulate, because it's not necessarily the regulatory frameworks of the past. How can we work together to make sure that these kind of inevitable transformations can be done without social disruptions?
We've been talking all through the day, both collectively and with our panels and in our breakout sessions, about systems, about partnerships, about particularly public and private. And so I'm particularly eager, now that you all have had a chance all day to think in a granular way about these issues, to engage with the Secretary General. So I throw open the floor to you to talk about where there are opportunities, where there are partnerships. And please wait for the microphone so that we can hear you. Yes.
Hi, good evening. First, I recently spent some time in Dadaab on the Somalian border, and I walked away very confused, very challenged by what I saw, but incredibly impressed by the UNHRC and what they were doing. So thank you for your work with that part of the UN. Second, today we have talked in so many ways about what different companies are doing to support their communities. But I was also struck that in many places where companies in the private sector are stepping in, these are areas that governments have traditionally provided that service: public education, infrastructure, public safety. And I'm troubled by the idea that either we're not holding our local governments accountable, or worse, that we've lost faith in their ability to act in these areas. So what would you recommend for the private sector? How can we support our governments in these areas? How can we engage civically? And what thoughts do you have in this area? Thank you.
Well, there is an area for philanthropy. There is an area for corporate social responsibility. There are many things companies can do in supporting different objectives of different areas with different communities. But essentially, what is relevant is to join efforts based on the business that a company does and making it relevant for the objectives of a country. Now, you mentioned education. It's clear that we need to look into education with different eyes, with the massive use of technology to make education possible and effective in today's world. And for that, public-private partnerships make full sense. And again, in these circumstances, you might have to associate that with innovative financing. So you need to probably bring private sector that has the technology, the capacity to do it. You need to have the government, and you need to have financial institutions able to support it in the developing world. But to a certain extent, this is also true in the developed world. So my experience here at UNHCR was that we really had the best partnerships with the private sector when we were doing with the private sector what the companies are supposed to do and make it relevant for our objectives. Again, there is a role for corporate social responsibility, there is a role for philanthropy, but what we need to have is a model in which the interests of the public sector investments and the interests of private sector investments can be convergent. And that has to do with the creation of the adequate environment. It has to do, in some situations, with some guarantees. People are reducing the risk. I mean, I can understand the risk in several countries because of political uncertainties and things of the sort. Maybe the best way to use official development aid is in reduction of risks, instead of just spending money, or providing guarantees for investment. So we need to find innovative mechanisms in which public action and private action can converge to deliver the kind of goods and services that are necessary in different parts of the world, in different ways, but always with this idea that things are changing very quickly and the traditional patterns no longer respond to the needs of today.
Hi, Secretary General Guterres. Thank you so much for your great leadership. I'm Elise Nelson from Vital Voices. And we obviously know that to achieve the SDGs, goal number 5 around the advancement of women and girls is absolutely critical to the underpinnings of the others. But we also know at the same time that only about 6 or 7% of development dollars support the advancement of women and girls. So how are you approaching this challenge of goal number 5 and how we achieve greater gender equality, which we know will certainly advance businesses and countries around the world? How are we working to do that?
Well, I'm going to be provocative. No, I could give you all the typical answers of programs that we have, whatever. But I think it's essentially a question of power. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. And the central question is the empowerment of women. For instance, empowering women to be women entrepreneurs is, in my opinion, an absolute priority in this perspective, looking from the economic point of view. And the empowering women in the political and administration areas is also equally essential. For instance, in the UN, we have now a program to reach gender parity. I have appointed until now 17 women and 15 men to the higher level of the United Nations. And I have a commitment that the higher, the political level, which means the Secretary Generals and the Assistant Secretary Generals of the United Nations, will be with total parity in the end of my mandate, and that until 2028 we will have parity across the board. Because I am a believer that power relations are essential, which means we need to really do it seriously in political systems. I'm very much in favor of a system of quotas in political systems. I'm going to say a barbaric thing. I would be very much in favor of a system of quotas in the boards of companies and in other aspects, because this will not happen naturally. I was reading a very interesting article just a few days ago speaking about gender equality and the way to gender equality. And then they say, the good news is that we are moving in that direction. The bad news is it will take 300 years. So we need to really introduce some mechanisms into the different systems to make it happen. And I introduced quotas in my political party 30 years ago. At the time it was 30% of each gender, and it worked. I tried to do it at parliament level, but we had a minority government and the whole opposition voted against, so we lost that battle. But I think we need to have some affirmative action on this and really to do everything that is in the books and in the strategies about gender equality, but then to really address the problems of power seriously. And it's even a question at family level. The most difficult problem I had as Prime Minister was to convince my country that family violence was a serious problem. It was entirely rejected by the public opinion. No, that we don't have family violence. And the police would not care about it, and the courts would not care about it. And indeed, we really put it in the political debate, and we did the reforms in the judiciary, in the police, in whatever that was necessary. And it's still a problem today. So the power relations problem is not only at political level, but it starts in the way families still exist. And I'm not talking about Pakistan. I'm talking about the United States of America today. Sexual harassment is still taking place in the most developed societies today. So I'm sincerely, sorry to be so provocative, I'm sincerely convinced that the questions of empowerment of women are absolutely crucial if we want to have better societies. And my experience, by the way, in all the bodies that I've been, government, is that decisions are better when you have a certain equilibrium between women and men. Only male groups or only female groups usually do not work very well.
Secretary General, I'm Pedro Pizarro with Edison International. You may have started touching on this, but I'm wondering if you could address this. So a number of us are CEOs of large organizations with decades-long histories going through a lot of change. You're the chief executive of a large organization with a decades-long history going through a lot of change. How do you see the UN, not only in terms of its objectives, but its organization itself, not only the member states, but the staff itself, the organization, the culture? What's your assessment of how it's doing?
Well, it's an organization that requires a lot of change because it is the victim of two trends. a centralizing trend within its structure, secretariat, and a micromanagement trend within the membership. So the member states, through the General Assembly, try to make sure that I have no margin of maneuver to do anything based on my own authority. So this has created a situation in which, really, today we have serious problems of management. Now, we have launched, they are all interlinked, but we have launched 3 reform processes that are, as I said, all interlinked. One is of the UN development system, which is essentially a problem of coordination of accountability of the different agencies that work at country level to make sure that they work in an effectively coordinated way. The UNICEF, the UNHCRs, the World Food Programs, the UNDPs, etc., that work in a coordinated way, that are accountable for what they do together, and not only each one accountable for what each one does in an isolated way. And then it has some repercussions at global level in relation to also the coordination and accountability mechanisms. And we are trying to, for instance, we have just created a steering committee of humanitarian development agencies because humanitarian development things are now completely overlapping, and resilience became a key word, resilience of societies, to be able to, I mean, if you look at the present disasters, it's clear that if societies will be resilient, the impact will be much less negative. The second dimension is the management reform, which has to do with the rules. Basically, it's a matter of delegation of authority internally, between me and the managers at all levels, going to the field it's a contract with the field and the managers. I mean, you have freedom to do what I was supposed to decide, but then you need to be accountable on that. And there must be a system of transparency for me to know what you are doing and for the others to know. But fortunately, we have now a software that more or less allows for it with some adjustments that still need to be made. Second, to have from the member states another contract in which, instead of ex-ante controls, move into ex-post controls, give me the freedom to do a number of things, and then I will respond, and there will be mechanisms of accountability, of oversight, of control, and of transparency to make sure that member states can measure the results of what we do. Instead of controlling ex-ante every decision I take, I cannot create a post in Geneva without asking the General Assembly. And General Assembly works by consensus, 193 countries. So you can see that this is not exactly the best way to manage your company. No? I mean, if you had 193 members on your board, and if you wanted to create a post in Geneva, you would have to have the consensus of the 193 members of the board, including in the board, of course, North Korea, the United States. I mean, as you see, it's not easy. But so we are trying to change this. And then there is another area, which is the peace and security area, where we need really a reform from peacekeeping to the structures in headquarters to support it, to adapt to the modern circumstances and to the modern world, and to make it also more responsive, more effective, more cost-effective. We are launching it. I must confess that we are getting a lot of support, contrary to what people would think in the beginning. Even you have seen President Trump that came to a session to say that he's supporting these reforms. And I've had, even from the G77 and the developing world, for the moment, a lot of buy-in. Let's see how it goes as the process goes by. But it is clear that, I mean, transparency and accountability are the two things that are essential for any reform to work in an organization that is rather opaque, and in which, as there is no real freedom to decide, nobody is responsible. And if something goes wrong, it's not me, it's not nobody. And this is a system that needs to be corrected. And I hope that we'll be able to substantially change it.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. All the best.